So if you look at the title of this YouTube video somewhere down here, you'll notice that there's no specific mention of a specific lens. And that's because I'm not going to be talking about a specific lens. It's more of a general category of lenses that work really well on Micro Four Thirds, and I've just recently discovered how great they are. The group of lenses in this general category are affordable and also have a relatively shallow depth of field, which really helps to create that really nice look on Micro Four Thirds cameras, which anyone who's ever shot on a Micro Four Thirds camera knows it's pretty hard to get shallow depth of field. This is due to a whole myriad of reasons which I don't completely understand, but basically because the sensor size on Micro Four Thirds is half the size of a full frame camera and everything is cropped in by 2, what it means is that for the same focal length, whether you want 50mm on full frame, you have to have 25mm on Micro Four Thirds. And even if you have the same f-stop on both, let's say f1.8, because the Micro Four Thirds lens, even though it crops in times 2, is technically a wider lens, 25mm instead of 50mm, you're going to have less depth of field. It's really confusing. I don't know if that made any sense to any of you, but I'm still pretty confused by it. That's just the reality. And let's jump into how we can mitigate that. So with Micro Four Thirds, there's 2 main ways to get rid of that lack of shallow depth of field. The first way is to get a lens with a really low f-stop, whether it be f1.4, f1.2, or even f1.0. But the problem with getting lenses with really low f-stops is that they can be quite expensive just because there's so much glass, the glass has to be perfect, and when they're shot wide open, it can often have pretty soft edges, which isn't ideal. And then the second way to mitigate this is to get a lens that's more telephoto, because the more you zoom into your subject, the more it compresses the background and the shallower depth of field you get. This means if we can pair a relatively telephoto lens with a relatively low f-stop, we can get really nice bokeh and shallow depth of field with our Micro Four Thirds cameras. And conveniently for us, these lenses are actually the cheapest ones on the market. They're the prime lenses that are 50mm, built for full frame cameras, and have an aperture of 1.8. And what this allows us to do is basically multiply that by 2, so we have a 100mm lens for our Micro Four Thirds cameras that have an aperture of 1.8, giving us that nice shallow depth of field. And when I say affordable lenses, I mean really, really affordable. I mean, most of these lenses are between $100 and $200, which in the lens world is pretty much unheard of, except for these 50mm lenses. So of course, if you're buying a Canon or Nikon lens and adapting it to Micro Four Thirds, you're gonna need an adapter for it, but they're actually really cheap to find. You can get them for like $20. You just clip them onto the other lens, attach it to your camera, and it's working perfectly with nice aperture control and things like that. So this is just a great way to go to really easily and quickly get that cinematic shallow depth of field on your Micro Four Thirds cameras. And I honestly just recently discovered I could do this because my first camera was actually a Nikon D3200, and I bought this 50mm lens for it, and I didn't really use it that much, but then I realized later that I could adapt it for my Micro Four Thirds camera, and when you stick it on there, it just looks incredible. So this is the lens here. It's just a little Nikkor 50mm 1.8G lens. As you can see, it's just a prime lens. Really simple, has focus throw here, and I have a little adapter here where I can change the aperture. Really easy there. And then the front, I just have an ND filter because with shallow depth of field like 1.8, you really need an ND filter on the front to stop down the light so you can get that really natural shutter speed when you're shooting outside in the sun. But something really nice about these zoomed in 100mm equivalent lenses on Micro Four Thirds is that you don't really need that fancy of a filter. I actually have a really cheap variable ND filter on the front here, but because it's so zoomed in, it only uses the middle part of the ND filter. It doesn't look at the outside, so you're not gonna see any vignetting like you might have on wider lenses. But yeah, I'm super glad I found this lens because it yields results that I never thought were gonna be possible on Micro Four Thirds unless you have really expensive lenses, just because it's so much harder to get that shallow depth of field. And this lens totally delivers and helps accomplish that look. For example, look at a few of these clips here and just look at that bokeh. My God, it is just so smooth, creamy, massive. It just looks so professional and amazing. So I'm a really big fan of this lens. Can't believe I didn't discover it earlier, but I'm gonna be shooting with it a lot more now. So there are a few things you need to keep in mind when you're shooting with a lens like this that's not specifically meant for your camera. Of course, there's not going to be any autofocus, so you really have to get good at manual focus, and because it is a photography lens, it's a little bit tricky to nail that focus because it's a shallow depth of field, so the focus ranges quite a lot, but if you get it nailed in nice, it is super sharp. Another thing you're going to want to keep in mind is that there's no stabilization built into the lens because it's meant for a different camera, and it's not going to be compatible with your Lumix camera, for example, so there's no stabilization in the lens, which is fine for most situations. Most cinema cameras and lenses don't have stabilization, but if you do happen to have a camera like the Lumix GH5 that has in-body image stabilization, this would just make it so much better because there are small jitters that happen when you use this lens handheld, especially because it's a 100mm equivalent. So it's so zoomed in that you can have some telephoto shake in there. So stabilization would definitely be nice with this lens, but if you throw it on a tripod or something, you of course mitigate all of that. And with a shallow depth of field like this, it's really incredible what you can cover up. So for example, in this shot, you can see there's the background, then I can zoom into a more mid-ground, a close-up, and then an extreme close-up all in the same shot. And as we were focused more to infinity, you couldn't see any of the closer objects because of the depth of field, it just blurs them out. So it's really good in adding emphasis to your shots and just making things look more clear. So to make this lens work with your Micro Four Thirds camera, all you need is the lens itself. So just like a 50mm 1.8 lens, the little adapter to make it work with Micro Four Thirds, and then on the front, just a cheap ND filter to stop down that light and bright situation so you can keep your f-stop down low at 1.8. So all in all, you can get this lens set up for under $200 probably, and you can yield some really impressive shots. Now, if you have like $150 more to spend, I would recommend probably getting the Lumix 42.5mm lens with a 1.7 aperture, so a little bit less zoomed in, but equally kind of telephoto shots with that shallow depth of field. It also has image stabilization built in, so again, gets rid of that little stabilization issue, and it's only about $350. So that's a little more expensive, but it would definitely work great for all Micro Four Thirds cameras. But anyway, that's basically it about this lens. I'm so stoked on this thing. I'm gonna throw in some shots after this so you can take a look at what this lens looks like, get a good idea on it, and see if you wanna buy one yourself. But honestly, I would highly recommend it. It really ups that production value and just makes your shots look so much better. So check this out.
I was alone and a quiver on the boat to ford the river, and oh, my hands were cold with that mighty river flowing. Sure he knows where he's going, and I have to wait. I struggled towards the land. Oh, when this sparrow called me home, the sparrow called me home. I felt the wind was blowing against the course that I'd been rowing. And I start to sink.
So for $200 lens on a $500 camera body, I think those shots turn out pretty dang good, and you see that bokeh in the background, that nice shallow depth of field. When you can get specific objects in the foreground in focus pretty nicely, even a little ways away, and then the background completely out of focus, just really emphasizing what you're focused on. So leave a comment down in the description down below or something, let me know how you think those shots turned out, but I'm really impressed. Oh, and if you like the music in that little sequence I just showed you, you should check out Artlist, which is the sponsor for today. You can get great music on their site that sounds like it's from actual artists, and I'm a huge fan of it. I use it in a ton of my videos, and I think it's just a great service for creators of all kinds. So it's actually really affordable for what you get, all the different music and tracks you can get inside of this platform. So if you want 2 months free though on their annual plan, you should click the link in my description down below. They'll set you all up and you can see how the pricing works and how the whole system works, and you can listen to their music. So yeah, check it out. So anyway, that's it for today. I just thought this was a cool topic that I don't think that many people are really aware of. And I definitely think more people should start using these 50mm lenses just because of how cheap they are, how crisp they are, sharp surprisingly considering the price, and how well they adapt to Micro Four Thirds cameras. And you'll likely see many more clips shot on this lens in the near future. So if you want to see those, be sure to subscribe to the channel. You'll see more filmmaking stuff, more short films, and I'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching.